Welcome back to Doomer Optimism. This is Nate, Tornado Nate, and welcome to Beef Week. This has been Beef Week. The initial plan was I had a series of interviews I was doing, and we're going to release them all in the same week. I don't know. There's been some scheduling issues with a couple interviews, so it might not be. It might be more like Beef Month, or maybe every week is Beef Week around here. That's fine, but I'm going to call it Beef Week anyway, just to stay with the theme. And today I'm here with Basel Musharbash. Um, did I get that right?
Nailed it.
Nice. Excellent. And he is a lawyer in Paris, Texas, who specializes in antitrust work. So we're going to kind of deepen what we talked about with Mike Callicrate in the last interview around specifically the antitrust issues and the monopoly issues that are going on in agriculture right now. Again, the kind of the purpose of this series of episodes is to put context in the great beef war of 2025, and what's been going on in the news and kind of the uh, angry ranchers and some real whiplash type statements from the president at this point, and to try to understand what's going on right now, but how this also sits in the last 5 years of work with antitrust and monopolies, and even a larger historical context as well. And Basil is the guy to help us do that, I think, because it's long and fascinating history, and Basil's right in the middle of it. So you've been on. We've talked to you before, Ashley, and I've talked to you on the podcast
We
before. I think
have.
you've been on a couple times, and so, still, though, maybe if you can introduce yourself, if you have anything else you'd like to say, and then we can kind of dive into the content of the episode.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate you for having me, and it's great to be back on the pod. I think you covered it. I'm an antitrust and trade regulation attorney. I work with farm groups like Farm Action and others on anti-monopoly policy advocacy. We push agencies to do their jobs fighting monopolies and making sure that um, big meat packers and big companies in the agriculture sector are not engaging in unfair trade practices. I also represent farmers, consumers, and workers and others in antitrust and deceptive trade practice cases in litigation. As part of that work, I've just had, the opportunity to dig deep into this stuff, the history of anti-monopoly policy, antitrust law in the agriculture space, and I'm glad to be able to share that anytime I can. So this is great. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. So, I think I have to find it real quick, but how I'd like to start today um, is I wish I had this pulled up. I want to just, I think, read uh, this statement that the president made, and so we'll still kind of start with the that most recent things. I was flirting with the idea, when I was introducing this, of calling this a emergency doomer optimism session, uh, to help contextualize what the hell is going on here. So I'm
Yeah.
going to read this statement, and then we can just start there and kind of work backwards, because I mean, I don't know. In my view, from where I sit, this is a truly remarkable thing. It's a truly remarkable statement. It's a real just remarkable. I don't know, good, bad, whatever. It's
Yeah.
it's like anyway. He put on his
It's
truth.
unprecedented. Yeah.
He put this
Yeah.
on his Truth Social. He said, Donald Trump says, "I've asked the DOJ to immediately begin an investigation into the meatpacking companies who are driving up the price of beef through illicit collusion, price fixing, and price manipulation. We will always protect our American ranchers, and they are being blamed for what is being done by foreign-owned meat packers who artificially inflate prices and jeopardize the security of our nation's food supply. Action must be taken immediately to protect consumers, combat illegal monopolies, and ensure these corporations are not criminally profiting at the expense of the American people. I'm asking the DOJ to act expeditiously. Thank you for your attention to this matter." How the hell did we get here?
Oh man. How long do you have? No, so I think the short story is that um a bunch of farmers and ranchers and others got very angry at the president for deciding to bail out Argentina and then import Argentinian beef, and in an effort to bring down beef prices. And then it seems like he finally had to bend to their will a little bit to to contain the political fallout from those decisions that he made a few weeks ago. So I think that's probably you know the most direct reason why we're here. It seems like, yeah.
Well,
Well,
let me give you my perspective or my summary real quick, and then you can kind of embellish or fill in things.
yeah,
So it's a little bit of a shorter media here. So I think what you're saying is sort of the catalyst for what this last few weeks has been, because this last few weeks has been really crazy. Like you said, it was more ranchers than farmers. Farmers, I think there's a separate thing going on with the soybeans, and they're pissed. They're pissed too. But it's a little bit of a separate thing. And farming and ranching cultures are actually really freaking different. They're different. They're not different politically insofar as like their top line. Yeah, they're going to generally support GOP politicians as a general rule. But like their interests are kind of different. Um, and this has been much more, in my view, rancher led, meaning just beef producers generally.
right.
And genuinely pissed about, and I think the thing that was really pissed was less about importing Argentinian beef exactly, because we do that already, we import it, but it was the president's specific way he said that beef prices were too high, and basically putting the fault at putting that at the feet of cattle
On the
producers.
ranchers.
Yes, and I
Yeah,
think that
yeah,
was the specifically how he sort of presented that and how he said that. I think that kind of set off the firestorm. And I would call it a firestorm. I mean, in this little in this little kind of niche, it's been a really big deal. As you can see, it kind of culminated in this statement by the president that. But to kind of back up further, um, this issue of the Packer monopoly isn't new, and the awareness of it isn't by any means new. In fact, the last administration was aware and taking slow and insufficient, but like they were doing, in my perspective, something. They weren't taking antitrust action, but they passed a big bill to try to, they were where they wanted to promote more local producers, things like that, and they had taken actions to do so. And then in the transition from the administration, I remember this is when you and I and Ashley talked. We were kind of, it was the early days of the Trump administration. We were kind of like, well, what's going on with the antitrust stuff with them? And it seems like not much. They kind of seem to pivot away from that sort of thing from my perspective. And in ag, it seemed like that just wasn't happening at all. Like it just seemed like, oh, this is kind of just business as usual on steroids, was my perspective. And so then really disappointing, honestly. And then so this, and including up all the way up through the Argentinian trade deal, and we need to import beef. It just seemed like, man, this is actively bad on farm and ranch issues, if what you're hoping for is some sort of reform. And then this is just an about face. It seems like, I think there was a ton of pressure. And my own personal take on it is that he's a pretty impulsive guy. He just watched them kind of lose an election, pretty much. Interesting. Lena Khan makes an appearance in the story here again, right? She gets
yeah,
in the headlines
yeah,
again, Antitrust in the headline, and then a day later he's like, "Hey, she's getting some attention." I don't know what it was, and I
yeah.
don't try to pretend to understand the man's mind. But I'm pretty happy with the statement, and really interested in seeing how it gets, putting some pressure on it, see that it gets followed up on. But fill me
Right.
in now. So that's sort of my sort of 30,000 foot view of the last few weeks with a little bit of context.
The story of monopolies in beef packing uh, goes back a long time, and um, you know, it sort of has fluctuated from time to time, between big promises and sometimes lackluster execution, um, which I think is sort of is cause for both optimism and caution when it comes to the president's statements. We've had, as you sort of laid out a little bit, we did get a sort of big four or big five, you know, meat trust around the turn of the 20th century in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and there was, they raised a real concern in the country about an emerging food monopoly because they work together, much like the big, there's a big four meat packers, but then there's, it's really the big five that dominate the entire protein landscape. And yeah, you had, the big five back then, they dominated meat packing, and they, there was a lot of concern that they were like going into grocery and they were going into distribution and they were making it so that both the farmer and the consumer were losing. And there was a big antitrust case in the late 1910s, but it was and it came on the heels of a big investigation by the Federal Trade Commission into what happened. But then it was, sort of the winds changed. World War One came to an end. The 1920s set in. Big business was ascendant again, and it was settled. And basically, the big four were allowed to keep their stranglehold on meat packing. They just weren't allowed to go into all of these other things like grocery retailing or owning stockyards and things of that nature. Um, but at least and at that time we also passed a law called the Packers and Stockyards Act, which was supposed to allow the USDA to regulate these big meat packers, in all sorts of ways, and keep them honest and keep them in line with, in their dealings with farmers and consumers. But um, the promise of that didn't really pan out until the 1940s when we sort of revitalized antitrust again, and uh, they were sort of chastened in by allowing new upstarts to emerge that eventually cut down the big five. In large part because we imposed rules on these markets that made it so that the big five couldn't exclude these smaller players from the market. And um, without now we sort of forgot all those lessons in the 1980s, and that's why we're here now again. We allowed mergers again, we allowed exclusive dealing again, we allowed all sorts of relationships to be, you know, undertaken by, the biggest players in the market, so that they can
Well,
entrench
let's
themselves, consolidate their position, and that gets to sort of, now where what's going on today. We have these big five and or big four specifically in beef packing, and um, you know the, we've seen, there's been some action to try to move against them again in the last few years. Like you mentioned, the Biden administration had done some rulemakings to, sort of um, revitalize the Packers and Stockyards Act, which prohibited unfair and deceptive trade practices. Um, but and they also brought a bunch of cases against the big four, along with private um, uh, ranchers and consumers, alleging that these big four meat packers and others have been colluding both to suppress the price of cattle and to raise the price of beef. Um, but unfortunately, we haven't seen anybody push for structural remedies, for breakups as yet. Um, and it's unclear why. And we're sort of now seeing, um, maybe the Trump administration will go in that direction. We can talk about sort of, can they do it? Will they do it? How can, what are the risks? But yeah, that's where we are now.
It reminds me of you have let's say you've got, and I'm a dog lover, so maybe this is going to be a really distasteful metaphor. We'll see. Um, Maybe this will go the way of like what's her name, Christy Nome or whatever, and people be like, "Ah, that Nate is a terrible person." But let's say you have just this terrible pit bull, right? Like, I have a pit bull. People don't get mad at me. I think pit bulls are fine dogs. But let's say you have a dangerous one, and man, this dog is awful. I mean, it will bite anybody that comes close to you. Um, Anybody that comes close to it. And, so you make sure you've got a good chain, you got this, that, all these ways, all these different things you go through to make sure that this dog stays safe and doesn't attack anybody. Meanwhile, it will attack anything that comes close to it. Sometimes you just have to put the dog down.
Yeah.
And it seems like that's the situation here. We're like bending over backwards to kind of like, hey, we're going to regulate, make these rules. But like JBS, these Brazilian beef brothers, like that company is just, we know it's bad. We know they're going to misbehave. We know they're going to manipulate the market. We know they're going to bribe politicians if they get a chance. Like, they're criminals. And like, maybe you just need to put them down. Not
Yeah.
literally. I'm not advocating political violence. I'm saying like corporate
Yeah.
death penalty, not literal, I
Yeah.
guess.
And I think people understate how criminal and just rife with corruption the rise of these companies has been. Um, I looked
People
in.
think, I want to
Yeah.
please continue saying, but people kind of think like, oh well, it's a small margin business, and these companies, they just, because they operate at economies of scale, and that's the story. It's just economies of scale, and it's like, well, no,
No,
tell the whole story here.
no, that is not. Yeah, that is definitely the story that we've been told, and it's definitely wrong. I mean, it's, you look at the history, and basically, you like I said, you had you had these big five, the meat trust big five in the 1940s, and we sort of, with antitrust enforcement, with trade regulations, we hemmed them in. We made it so that they can't, push out the competitors. And so competitors started emerging in the 1950s and 1960s. Um, and those competitors, initially were, good things, right? They were, they offered competition for cattle, they offered competition for the consumer, but eventually by the 1970s, we started relaxing those antitrust enforcement and trade regulations, and the USDA especially was just absolutely horrendous at like enforcing the Packers and Stockyards Act. And so you ended up with, these, a company like IBP, which is the predecessor to today's Tyson. Um, they started rising by using all kinds of just shady tactics, right? So they would do things like, for example, start buying all the cattle from like competing meat packers, until they're like, those competing meat packers distribution networks dried up, and then they would suddenly stop buying the cattle so that the competing meat packer would just collapse, and then they would buy them out.
These are
They
all
worked with
variations.
like
These are
mafia.
variations on the theme. These are variations. I want to hear that story, but I'm just, for our audience, trying to. These are variations on the theme of the Walmart playbook, right? Which is, you move in, you sell everything dirt cheap so that no one can compete, and then as soon as your competitors are gone, you raise the prices because you have the pockets deep enough to do that. You can take loss for years to sell shit cheap. When you have no competition, you can do whatever you want. That's sort of all variations on that basic playbook, correct?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And they would do that in in all sorts of ways. So like I said, they worked with like mafia bosses to get into different markets. They worked with, they did things like sell at a predatory price to supermarkets so that they would, get the contracts and drive their competitors out of business. Um, they also did things like ink exclusive contracts with like bigger feedlots. So, what would happen is like in the like 60s, you had like the emergence of the feedlot model or industry, and these emerging meat packers would like sign these long-term exclusive deals with the feedlots, which seemed good at first for the feedlots, but really what it was doing is it was tying up the supply of cattle in a given region, so that if you had a competitor wanting to come in to open up a new plant, they couldn't find enough cattle to support a really big plant. But nonetheless, like even with all of these anti-competitive and exclusionary practices, still in 1980, the biggest four meat packers only had, I believe, 36% market share. Um, what really changed things is that in 1982, the Reagan administration uh, announced that it was basically not going to enforce the law against corporate mergers anymore. And within 5 years
Fucking
of that,
Reagan.
yeah, yeah, it's like Reagan and Carter are like the roots of our problems. And people think they're opposites, but they're not actually. On economics, they're not. And yeah, so the Reagan administration announces they're not going to enforce the law against mergers, and within 5 years, Cargill moves in, ConAgra moves in, IBP starts buying up competitors, Tyson starts buying up competitors, and by 1988, basically, the big four have emerged, um, and they have 75 to 80% national market share in both the cattle markets and the beef markets.
Well, there's a really interesting. This is probably, I mean, they're related, but this is a bit of a stretch. But I was talking to Mike, and he was talking about the percentage of the consumer dollar that the ranchers got, right? So in 1980, when you had about, like you said, a 36% market share for these big four, you had about an 80% of every dollar spent went to the rancher, right?
Yeah,
So if you bought beef
70,
for
80
a
cents.
dollar,
Yeah,
80, yeah, 70, 80 cents of that would go to the rancher, right? Fast forward, then you have now 85% market consolidation with the big four, and it's 35% of 35 cents on the dollar go to the rancher. So like those two numbers are almost perfectly inverse of one another.
yeah, and
Coincidence?
co- pure coincidence, I'm sure. No, and actually, like if you dig deeper into the concentration data, we find that like in specific cattle procurement regions, like cattle procurement markets, the concentrations that was actually a lot higher at the end of the 1980s, and so like that explains a lot of why um, the consumer dollar split changed to favor the meat packers so much, and since then, they've been entrenched in place. Not by efficiencies really. It's more that they've just continued to buy up competition. They've inked, exclusive and arrangements with the big grocery retailers, which also started emerging and buying each other up in the 1990s. Um, and eventually in the 2000s, we see them sort of consolidate into their current form um, when JBS, which was this Brazilian meatpacking giant, uh, basically bribed the entire Brazilian government, and I'm not exaggerating. They literally bribed thousands of politicians. They were indicted for that in federal court here and in Brazil. Um, JBS bribed thousands of Brazilian politicians to get loans from like Brazilian state banks to come to the U.S. and buy up some of our biggest meat packers. And so that's how JBS came to have 20 or 25% of uh, the beef market. And then you had a company called Marfrig come in the late 2010s to buy, it's called um, I believe it's called American Beef, if I'm not mistaken. So, or National Beef, sorry, National Beef. And yeah, so now you have these big four, and people say, oh, it's a story. The reason they stay on top is that they're efficient, and but if you look under the hood, the efficiency is not at the like corporate level, right? So like you have these companies are like corporate empires. They have each of them has however many plants, you know, 6, 7, 10, dozen plants or more, and all of these plants individually are at highly efficient scale. So it's like they don't actually need to be part of this corporate empire in order to be efficient, and there's no reason to indicate that they couldn't be efficient alone. But they've been bought up basically and amalgamated into these conglomerates that now we
Well, and
can't
even
seem to
even
shake off.
even then, Mike did a great job in the last interview I did with him of kind of talking about efficiency too, and how even those aren't as efficient as it seems compared to smaller operations. They just have much cheaper labor.
Right,
So like some of their efficiencies are efficiencies that we really shouldn't be very proud of. Um,
right, right.
and
And
that they're not actually that much more efficient per a unit of labor, breaking down per cattle, for instance. They don't do that much better,
right. Yeah,
if
that's
any.
true. And I think you're right. And I believe, um, yeah, like researchers have looked into it and they would tell you that like basically it's a linear relationship between like how many heads of cattle you process at a plant and like how much you're spending on electricity and maintenance and all of these other things. Um, so there's not like a whole bunch of efficiencies of scale that are just
Yeah,
like technical in nature. And basically, all of them are exhausted by the time you're hitting like if you're just slaughtering 300,000 heads of cattle at a plant, you've exhausted essentially all of the technical efficiencies of scale that you could possibly have. But
long time ago.
right, and but now we're seeing plants slaughtering 1 million head of cattle a year, and we're told it's efficient, but on the one hand, there's no real evidence that it is, and on the other hand, we don't know how much inefficiency that causes, right?
Discussing that economies of scale don't always work how they are sold, and in fact sometimes are the reverse, actually, and you create bigger problems with bigger scale.
Right, right, yeah, um, and yeah, and to that point, like you have other, um, you have other issues of scale that come with scale, right? So people often talk about how the bigger plants are more efficient in terms of labor, but like this actually goes back to the 1960s that when they first started opening these big plants in rural areas. Um, a big part of what made them competitive is that labor was, they were so big, such big employers in those regions that they could exercise market power. They could suppress wages for laborers in that space, and they could also impede unionization as well, um, which made it so that they could basically pay workers less than they were paid in in plants and that that previously were in the big cities. Now, of course, we want plants to be in smaller towns and rural communities. The problem is sort of how the power of those plants as large employers is wielded, and that's always been a problem with these big these big four meat packers, sort of a critical tool in their toolbox has been exploiting labor, and particularly illegal immigrant labor. That
Well,
has
yeah,
been a
let's think
bedrock.
about that
Yeah,
in the context of agriculture for a second because it's illustrative. So let's say I mean, you have a thing right now in rural America where on the one hand, it's like, well, we need actually tons of dirt cheap exploited immigrant labor to come in and work at these factories, these cutting plants, etc., because we can't get domestic labor to do it. At least, and the reason we can't is because these jobs are fucking terrible.
yeah,
And we say things like, "Oh, no one wants to work this and that," but it's like, well, no, we probably ought to provide like the conditions of the. There's a reason that and it's not just because people don't want to live in rural areas. People don't want to work at jobs that are this bad. And you only can get the workforce you need with people who are pretty well exploited.
right.
And that's the situation. So if we really want to um, address the illegal immigration, a big part of that is making these plants smaller and provide actually decent jobs to the community instead of these awful jobs that produce humanitarian and environmental catastrophe wherever you put them.
Yeah, yeah, and yeah. I mean, these to give you a sense of how terrible these jobs are. Um, People just routinely suffer tremendous injuries in meat cutters at the plants. Are routinely suffering injuries. They uh, they can't take bathroom breaks. They are paid a pittance, and um, I don't have the statistics off the top of my head, but I remember reading how much more frequent injuries are at these plants compared to any other uh, you know manufacturing industry, and it's just off the charts, and it just blew me away. And a big part of that is just that these companies hire folks who are in the country illegally, and don't have are disenfranchised essentially, and then they use that in order to outcompete honest businesses and that try to do things right. And so,
And Mike
against
described
this
this.
background,
Mike
yeah,
Callicrate described this really, really nicely for us. Just compared to how like he would, like just the chain of beef. Went from live animal to a packing plant where the animal would be killed and then hung into halves or quarters. And when they hang, you hang them for 6 or 7 days. When that actually creates a real food safety benefit when you hang them and age them like that. And then they would go hanging to a skilled butcher that would cut them up. And during that process, you had the kill plant. You had a job that was much more reasonable and humane, and a good job. And the same at the butcher, but we move to box beef, so that at the plant they're both cutting it up, and that's when you really get the assembly line doing the same thing, repetitive stress injuries.
yep,
Just the fast pace creates more injuries. It's a terrible work environment, and it produces more food safety issues, and it can lends itself to just further consolidated ownership rather than like independent businesses with good jobs, right? So these are the costs we're paying to wring a few pennies out that actually we don't even get those pennies. Those pennies are being wrung out by the Packers themselves. Like, so for them to wring out a few pennies, this is the cost that you and I pay.
right, right. Yeah, and this is what's been lost in all of this talk of efficiency and how good consolidation is over the last 40 years, is that we've been deluded by sort of economists working with stick figure models in their heads about how uh, how companies work, and in we've sort of convinced ourselves that, oh, if we can, every few cents of efficiency we wring out of the process, through consolidation or through unfair trade practices, that gets passed on to consumers in terms of lower beef prices, and so that's worth it. And setting aside this, the notion that like, you know, setting aside the notion that we should give up economic liberty, economic fairness in pursuit of, a few cents cheaper beef, which I think is a ridiculous notion if you actually put it to people. But setting that aside, when you have, just four or five or even, just 10 companies controlling a market, it's very, very easy for them to coordinate and make sure that they don't transfer those savings, those efficiencies down to consumers. It's much easier for them to coordinate to make sure that they keep, a larger percentage of the profits, um, on the product than otherwise. And so you don't get the full, the consumer doesn't get the benefit of these efficiencies. It's these
We just
middlemen
had a
that
nice we had
control
a
them.
nice illustration of this. We had a nice illustration of this just now, which
Right,
right when Trump announced the Argentinian beef deal or the prospective beef deal, and and set off that firestorm, and then what happened in the market was that live cattle prices went down, so the rancher selling his cattle got less immediately. Um,
right.
but the price of beef at the store didn't drop. In fact, the price of box beef went
Went
up
up.
at the
Yeah,
same time, right? And so this is
right.
a really fucking good deal if you're the middleman, right?
Yeah,
The price you're paying goes down and the price you're getting goes up. Great deal.
yeah,
Rigging an economy is pretty sweet.
yeah, yeah. It's great business if you can get it. Uh, and I think that's, we've been seeing a lot. There's been examples of that. Over the years, especially like in the last few years. And I think this one is the one that finally, broke through, like I guess broke the camel's back. It's a- and and I think part of it has to be perhaps that like, you know, um, ranchers are, a significant part of the Trump and Republican coalition, and um, he did something that was, really contrary to their interests and really infuriated people. Um,
I heard
and
somebody say around here this was just a local person I was talking to
yeah,
in the industry, and he was like, politicians are afraid of cows. And I was like, that's interesting. It's an interesting statement, but I do think if you look at the percentage of, like the size they make up of economy, like I think that there is maybe a little bit of outsized influence there. If it's really flexed in the same way all at once, which is that's the big sticking point.
yeah, I don't, yeah, I mean, it's, yeah, I don't know exactly how to explain it. I know that there are definitely, in specific states, you have, an outsized number of ranchers, and they have and they have influence, and um, but I also think it's, it's this, it's probably just a prime example. I think part of it is probably that, the problem for Trump has been that he was elected on a populist platform, of draining the swamp and tackling sort of the establishment and entrenched power in different ways, um, and reducing the cost of living, of course. And I think partly because of sort of like just the baseline of like the Republican Party in Washington, and like who gets recruited to like staff a Republican administration. He just hasn't really been acting on that, and he's and so, when you get a situation where something as, central as the price of beef is becoming a political issue, and the president responds to it by saying we're going to import more beef, and we're sort of putting the blame on the rancher, instead of the big corporations in the middle, um, it's it starts being a real headache and a real sort of symbol of like that the administration is straying from the commitments it was elected on, or something like that.
There's no one. There's no swampier swamp in America than JBS and Cargill. Like, there's not. You can. I mean, you could probably. I mean, you can in any industry. I'm sure you can find things just as swampy, but nothing swampier.
No, I mean it is incredible. On the one hand, it's incredible. I've sort of laid out some of the history of like how they came to be, but then there's like the other history of how they've escaped accountability for all of it, which is, I don't have any evidence of shadiness, but it just seems strange. Like I believe the biggest, I don't know if it was JBS at the time or if it was Tyson, but there were big cases in the 2000s against these dominant meat packers for hiring illegal immigrants, and for whatever reason, those cases just fizzled away and didn't amount to much. There have been antitrust cases. There were big Packers and Stockyards Act cases against the meat packers, IBP in particular, in the early 2000s, because of some sort of really shady manipulations it did, along with Cargill, in the hog market. And those, were they actually won at the district court level, and then they went on appeal, and they were, well, actually, they won at the jury level, and then the judge dismissed the case. Um, so it's just they've been able to wrangle their way out of accountability for all of the things that they've done in ways that make you really think twice, like what's going on here. And
Well, and
Yeah,
even if they do get convicted, right? They're gonna just pay a fine, and that is like basically a speeding
right,
ticket to them, and move
yeah.
on about their day. It's just part of the cost of doing business is breaking the law, paying a ticket, moving on.
So far, yes, yes. So far, yeah, that has been yeah. Either they somehow wrangle out of it, or they get convicted and they just end up paying a fine. Um, and that's where we've been. And hopefully now things change. But yeah, we'll see.
So I want to zoom out a little bit because I think one of the things that I want to zoom out and think about in the economy as a whole. Um, so one of the things that the anti-monopoly sort of boomlet or movement of the last few years has kind of helped me understand and kind of changed my thinking a little bit um, is just around the importance of how we frame the economy, and looking for fair and accessible markets is what we're going for. And there's been a lot of rhetoric my whole life, talking about free markets. um and it's an interesting comparison, right? Because the idea of free market sort of suggests that it's just that's left to its own devices. Like, the free market is just simply what a market, like, it's this magic thing that is like invisible hand. There's no intervention. It's free. It just does. And somehow uh that promotes competition, and it just kind of makes everything work uh well, without the need for us to control the market at all. And that's what a free market suggests. Now, it seems to me that a free market, kind of like a truly free market, leads just to cartels and mafia behavior. That's what it looks like to me. But to try to like be sympathetic to, I know a lot of friends I talk to tend will say that, like, the only reason monopolies ever arise is because of government intervention. Like, it's the co-option of government levers by corporation that cause the monopoly power. Like, they utilize government to pull themselves up, and no question that happens. But I would contend that that's not the only reasons that monopolies arise. that monopolies will rise because they're able to, once a player in a market does well, like they have some success and then they have a little bit of loose change in their pocket, they can start to engage in some of this behavior to elbow out more room in the market. And they're doing that without any intervention. Now they might reach a certain scale and then they're like, hey, this government, that's a useful tool as well. But
Yeah.
I don't think that is necessary for monopoly behavior to begin. And I do think that what we're really looking for here is a accessible and a competitive market. That's when capitalism works. And I think I've been more bullish a little bit from the understanding anti-monopoly movement on the idea that capitalism can work and has worked and isn't necessarily inherently bad if we sort of ensure that we have accessible and competitive markets.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I believe in the free enterprise system, right? But I'm very careful about using the words free enterprise, not capitalism or, just free markets, because what we're really trying to protect is the ability of, you know, people to embark on business for themselves and make choices for themselves, and make of their lives what they will, um, in the marketplace. And I think that often gets lost in these conversations. Um, the when I've looked at the history of these companies, I've often found that it's right, like you said, it's not that the government created the monopolies. It's that the it's that the monopolies got it's the lack of regulation of corporate mergers, unfair trade practices that led to these monopolists being able to consolidate power over the marketplace and entrench themselves against competition. So a good example of that, I think, is in meat packing, right? So, we talked about how um, the 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 imposition of these new rules in the antitrust space in the 1940s and early 50s, how that like made room for these smaller meat packers to arise and challenge the dominant big five, meat trust packers of the early 20th century, and those guys, kept competing and gaining market share all the way through the 1970s. I think people in the meatpacking industry often point to the the 1968 federal meat inspection law, which subjected uh, meat packing plants to USDA inspection as some sort of as a regulation that really uh, that makes it harder for small meat packers to compete. And I do agree with them, and I've seen it in my own practice, uh, that the USDA has, especially in like since the 1980s and since the 1990s, treated small meat packers unfairly in its inspection of their plants and regulation. But at the same time, like when you look at concentration after 1968, it actually didn't change much. Was describing earlier, even all the way up to 1980, um, the biggest four meat packers had a market share of about 30, 35, 36%. Um, what what really spurred the consolidation that we have today is, like I mentioned before, it was the government, under the Reagan administration, deciding we're just not going to enforce the laws against corporate mergers. And so I do think we sort of have to revitalize the fact, which revitalize the notion, which is deeply rooted in American history, that we need to guard against the concentration of power, period, right? We need to guard against the concentration of power by private actors, private corporations, as well as by, by the government or in the government by politicians and public officials. And I know it's a sort of a it's a tough balance sometimes, right? Because you kind of have to empower a government official in order to counter
Yeah.
private power. But we've shown, I think, throughout our history that we do have this ability, right? We do have this ability to, empower public officials, just enough so that they can, make sure that private corporations are not taking over our markets, that we still have the freedom of enterprise, um, without, going too far and tipping into a situation where the government is, for example, taking over industry or depriving people of, or itself depriving people of the freedom of enterprise.
So the Trump administration is very interesting on this. And by interesting, I simply mean interesting, not like good, bad. I'm just saying interesting. Like, because
Yeah,
for better and for worse, I would say, in some like, and I think this is why a lot of his critics, will yell fascism, 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 because one of the things that this president will do is he is not afraid to just be like, I'm president, I'm going to just use power, right? I'm just going to use power because I'm the president, you know? And I feel like we have been sort of conditioned, and a lot of it, separation of powers is very a good thing, right? But we've, I think, dispersed power to such a degree that, like, for instance, enforcing of, like, just specifically staying within this, like enforcing antitrust, regulating agriculture, things like that. What you have is you have government by bureaucracy, which is afraid to use power, and accommodates the corporate power interest, and like, I think the problem actually in some ways has been, hey, we need to use power over these corporations. And it's like, well, no, we can't do that. We can't do that. Everything's a committee, everything's this and that. And so Trump's in here, right? And I'm no admirer of Trump. I'm not, that's not but in this, it's very fascinating here. Because he's, negotiating things and he sees this. And then finally he's like, well, fuck this. Let's use power here in this very aggressive way. And he does this in other domains, and I think it's one of the things that makes people crazy. And I believe that he oversteps many times in many circumstances, that he oversteps that and he abuses power. Sure, we don't need to litigate everything and have a whole verdict, but I'm saying in this context, it's
right.
very interesting, the way that he's using power, and I think there are things that we could learn from that. And I think that there are, I mean, this is a broader thing. I think that the Democrats and the left have kind of related to Trump entirely wrong ever since he came on the scene. Um, uh,
Agreed. Yeah.
Instead of trying to see how things can be worked to the advantage of issues we care about, it's just been like heels dug. No, like, anyway, that's a whole separate conversation. But I do think that watching this in a very focused in way has been pretty interesting to see how the government's use of power can be a hindrance, but also, like, is sometimes actually really necessary at a certain point. And I think this is that point. Like, you can't work. You need to put the dog down. Is the basically what we're seeing here.
Yeah.
I don't know if that
Yeah.
made
I
sense,
heard.
but yeah,
No, that made a whole lot of sense. It's funny. You brought the dog analogy. I'll bring another one. I saw this TikTok the other day. It's This person was basically saying, we've you know people are, it was talking about young people, and this person was saying, I don't think young people hate capitalism. I don't think they love socialism. I think what it is that they hate the fact that they're living at sort of like the end of what seems like the end of capitalism. And she was like, it's like the board, it's like the game of Monopoly, right? If you just play Monopoly and you keep playing, keep playing, keep playing, eventually get to a point where somebody owns all the properties. And then you're
yes,
just going around and you're just paying them over and over. And so you can't keep playing anymore. It's done. Right. And she was like, well, that's where we are now.
yeah,
And,
yes,
that's where we are
exactly,
in America. And we're just like going around and all of, paying these monopolies in all of the, necessaries of life. effectively. And if you have small business competition, it gets gobbled up by the incumbent players. Um, and so you need a board reset. You need someone to come in and say, we need to reset the game so that you again have, a competition to see who can win. And hopefully this time we can do it with rules in place to make it so that nobody can monopolize the board like we have today. And I think that's Trump's appeal, right? Is that he basically promised a board reset of sorts, and he is, in many cases not afraid, like you said, not afraid to use power to accomplish his ends. And um and I do think, and I think that perhaps is like that perhaps will tell us something about how serious he is about this announcement, right? Because he can be very aggressive, and I can tell you there are, you know, there's a whole lot he can do beyond just saying, going to the Department of Justice and saying, "Hey, investigate these guys, and let me know if you can bring a case in a year or two." Um, yeah, I'm happy to dig into that. There's a lot he can do, and hopefully he does, but we'll see. Yeah.
Well, and maybe he will, maybe he won't have the appetite for it. We'll see. Again, there's a lot of this is only this is one statement on its own. It doesn't. The thing it does mean though is that I think is impactful, regardless of what happens next. Is the sitting U.S. president named this issue specifically and called it out. And if you think the bully pulpit matters at all, like that's, I mean, to name that, like it's a conversation shifting event in my view. To have him name that specifically, and you've heard the big four, big four, big four. It's been percolating up and up and up the last few weeks. People, and then like, bam, it's named, it's out there. And I don't know that that's going to be easy, even if they kind of start to be like, oh shit, this is a can of worms. I don't know if we want to do that. I don't think it's going to be that easy to sort of shove back in the bottle.
No, I don't think it will be. I mean, first of all, I think you see it across the economy. Like the word monopolies, just like 5 years ago, I remember people in my space, the anti-monopoly space, sort of thinking that the word monopoly was like too technical, and that like people wouldn't respond to it. And now it's like it's pretty common. Like people are talking about the problem of monopolies in our economy, and so I don't think the genie can be put back into the bottle. And now you have, especially when you've had the president of the United States, you know, call out monopolies and and illegal collusion in an industry as important as meatpacking. Um, and I think it's sort of similar in some respects to, Biden did this thing early in his administration where he issued an executive order on, I think it was called the executive order on revitalizing competition in the American economy. And, you know, that I think was more for, the sort of audience of lawyers and policy people who focus on antitrust. But it was basically a statement by the president of the United States that the purpose of antitrust law is to protect the distribution of power and ensure the continuation of competition in our economy. And it really shifted the conversation. And I think Trump, being Trump, this is what makes him interesting as a politician. He um, did something very similar, but in a populist way, where he's saying out loud, we have to go after monopolies. Um, yeah, and I hope what it triggers is that like now you have lawmakers in Congress, take their jobs seriously and look into how can they, act on these problems quickly. I think, so far we've been, you know, politicians have gotten now comfortable saying, oh, DOJ, the Department of Justice, the Federal Trade Commission should investigate and like maybe bring a lawsuit. And they've sort of gotten comfortable offloading that responsibility onto the agencies, which, to be frank, like they're not funded to do all of this. Like they don't have the resources to act as quickly as we need them to act. Um, and even if they, prioritize this, it would take them years to bring a case against the big four meat packers and then hopefully convince a judge to break these guys up. When Congress could just pass a bill breaking up the big four meat packers, and imposing rules on them to make sure that they don't just reconsolidate. So
And
I do
that's
think
and
it's
that's
a sea change. Yeah.
yeah, for sure. So the last two U.S. presidents in a row have made statements prioritizing this. And so if you were right, like if you were appointed special advisor to the president, and we'll do whatever you want, Basil. What are things that could be done? Just give me the program of like, hey, if we were freaking serious about this, like, and I agree, there's a kicking down the road thing with the Department of Justice that's like, yeah, maybe they're trying to kick the can down the road because I'm not sure how many people have the appetite for this fight. Interestingly, I just also wanted to mention that Trump's statement got a lot of retext, retweets, and promotion by other Republican senators echoing it, which is that's mind blowing to me. That like you've
Yeah.
got Republican senators being like antitrust action. What
Right.
world is this? It's different.
Yeah.
This is a different
Yeah.
world. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, I mean, I'm very interested in seeing them not hide behind a multi-year judicial process, that they can kind
Right.
of obfuscate around. But if they're serious, why don't you lay out for them how they can actually do it now?
Yeah. So there's a few things that they can do really quickly. On the one hand, Congress can, pass a law breaking up, the biggest three or four meat packers into, like I said, sort of uh, a number, just a portion of their plants and like associated facilities, that can operate efficiently and all of that, but make it so that they have to compete with one another. And so, like Congress can do that itself. It doesn't have to wait on the Department of Justice. And to make things easier, still, there are. It's not like the Department of Justice hasn't been investigating these meat packers, and so there's already lots of expertise um, among current and former Department of Justice officials and in the USDA to like support Congress in drafting that kind of bill to break up the meat packers. So that's one thing that that Congress can do and that Trump could push Congress to do. But without Congress, there are Trump has much quicker levers he can pull to stimulate competition. The first thing he can do is debar, basically ban JBS from government contracts, um, and potentially ban some of one or more of the other biggest meat packers from government contracts because they've engaged in especially JBS. It's been convicted of engaging in just rampant corruption, right? It's also been effectively they've also been convicted of engaging in um, collusion to raise prices. Those things usually get a company banned from government contracts. That's not happening. That hasn't happened. It didn't happen under the first Trump administration. It didn't happen under the Biden administration. It hasn't so far happened under the second Trump administration. But if Trump were to do that, and he can direct the USDA to do this, there's legal authority to do it. Um, then what could happen is that the USDA could prioritize getting, buying beef from for government programs from these smaller meat packers, and that will create competition and will foster the rise of these smaller competitors to the dominant monopoly of the big four. And so, those are just a few of the actions they can take, but then you also have the things that are already afoot in Congress and that people have been talking about, like passing a law mandating country of origin labeling and passing the Prime Act, which I'm sure folks who listen to this podcast are familiar with because of how closely associated it is with Doug Massey. Um, I think those can be really helpful steps, right? So, it, I- mandatory country of origin labeling would help with making sure that a big lever for the dominant meat packers in controlling beef and cattle prices is cross-border flows of beef, and MCOOL would um, make those cross-border flows a lot harder, um, and it would also give you know domestic meat packers a fair shot. They could uh, honest meat packers would have an honest shot at sales in the marketplace to people who want to buy American beef, and I, you know, and so I think those are also important things that can be done. My sort of caution around them is that I do think there is, you see it in some folks in Congress, like Mike Lee, and to some extent Representative Massey and others on the Republican side, that they're sort of quick to embrace MCOOL and the Prime Act as sort of substitutes for antitrust enforcement. And, you know, maybe we just need to try that to just and see if it works, just to sort of finally get to a point where lawmakers are like, okay, fine, we'll bite the bullet and break these guys up. Um, but I sort of worry that um, we're kind of we're these things, these sort of good measures, but not full measures, are being pushed as a substitute. So, so we'll see.
Yeah,
But
I think it would be
yeah,
wasting some of the momentum of the moment to settle for those. I'm a supporter of both things and have been. But I don't think
right,
they do. I don't think they do. I don't like. I'm in full agreement. They don't. They'll make it marginally easier. But it's been pointed out. Greg Gunthorpe pointed out. He's a Iowa farmer who farms hogs and owns a plant and really knows this stuff backwards and forwards. And has pointed out that basically there is already a Prime Act for poultry, and it doesn't do anything with the monopoly problem.
right,
Like it doesn't solve that issue. It makes it easier locally to sell some product, but it doesn't actually solve the bigger problem. And so we do kind of have some evidence of that in hand already. And if it doesn't work in the poultry, I don't think we have any reason to think that that would be adequate in beef. I don't know that there's any reason to think that it would be different. Um, so I think they're great. This is like you're saying, it's not a anti Prime Act or anti country of origin labeling at all. It's just those
right,
are not sufficient to the scale of the problem in any way.
right, exactly. Um, yeah,
How would you?
yeah,
Here's another question I want. Okay, so we asked. Here's what are some things that policymakers could do if you were special advisor to, say, Chuck Schumer. How can the Democrats engage in this in a helpful way to achieve aims that the Democratic Party should support? Um, I have nightmares sometimes of like, oh, now the president has said this, now Trump has said this, and the Democrats are going to start defending JBS. Um, in which case I'm all the way out. In which case I'm all the way out, like completely. But like, so how can they,
yeah,
rather than just be a party of anti-Trump, how can they engage in this issue and maybe try to build on the momentum of the moment rather than um, something
Yeah.
stupid like they're apt to usually do. Sorry, I'm pretty snarky about the Democratic Party these days. I should try to be nicer.
Hey, I am too, man. I mean, it's if there is a stupid thing to be done, the odds are the Democrats will do it. Um, no, I mean, so uh, I've actually talked to folks on the Hill about this on the Democratic side. I mean, if they're smart, what they would do is outflank Trump, right? Like they should come out and say they should be the ones proposing the bills to break up JBS, and then daring Trump to be like, "Can
Great
are you
idea,
going
Mr.
to jump on
President.
board?"
We think you're on
Yeah,
the right track. This is a fantastic
right,
idea. We support you
right.
completely. Here's how you can do it.
Yeah, and I could tell you that there are already probably folks from the Biden administration antitrust division who would probably come out and say, who probably, help the Democrats draft that bill because they're experts on this industry and efforts to enforce the antitrust laws in this industry, and who would come out and say, we've done the investigation, right? We already know what has to be done. So, like, why is the president dilly dallying by instructing the DOJ to do yet another multi-year investigation into the big four meatpackers? And I think that would be incredibly good policy, but also really good politics, right? I mean, that's what we're seeing with all of these campaigns that have attracted attention around the country. Dan Osborne in Nebraska, Graham Plattner in Maine, um, Mamdani in New York, love him or hate him, and even Mickey Sherrill in New Jersey. The focus of those campaigns has been on I want to do concrete things to actually bring down the cost of living, to actually improve your livelihood. And they haven't couched things in platitudes. They haven't just spoken in, you know, general bromides. They've been like, no, no, no. I'm going to go up against, the powers that be, specifically the specific powers that are, undermining your quality of life, raising your cost of living, bringing down your livelihood, bringing down your wages, and I'm gonna, make things better. We see that
We
with
need
Dan Osborne,
politicians that
right?
are yeah, that are ready for a fight, like and not one of these, theater fights against the other party, but like, hey, let's fight Google. Let's fight JBS.
Yes,
Let's fight.
right,
Let's do it. Let's fight because I
right.
love the way you present it. I think it is a Monopoly game that's near its end. And interestingly, for me at least, the game Monopoly was invented by someone in Macomb right down the road here. And it was kind of an anti-capitalist game in its design, but kind of has been co-opted. But now it's maybe time to use that as like, hey, we've got this perfect metaphor here. The game has been played out, and the monopolies are entrenched. How do we get out from under this thing? Let's fight.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And we're sort of, um, yeah, I think we're at a point where the party that shows itself to be willing to offer that board reset in concrete ways is gonna be winning. Um, yeah, and you see that in these campaigns, right? Like Dan Osborne has been basically has been running now against monopolies, right? The other day I saw him tweet about how he listed uh, all of the monopolies, the concentration in every part of our food system, from seeds and pesticides to fertilizers to machinery to meat packing to grocery retail, um, all of it. And then he was like, "This isn't a free market. This is an economic dictatorship." And it seems to be working well for him. And I think if Democrats are smart at this point, they would. embrace that in Congress with
Yeah,
concrete legislation. Yeah,
if they're smart, you guys can do it.
if
Come
they're
on.
smart. And and and
I would
and
love.
this is
Wouldn't
this
that
is
be
the
nice
part.
to be a race to the top instead of a race to the bottom? Let's see who can want to hit these guys harder.
No, and it's so funny to me, and it makes me want to rip my hair out because here's the thing about the politics of the meatpacking industry. The JBS and Cargill and National Beef and Tyson, they're huge donors for the Republican Party, but on the Democratic side, they're really not. Like they're not powerful. They're not. I mean, they're powerful politically in the country, but they're not huge donors on the Democratic side. And so, like, it seems very strange to me that that the Democratic Party wouldn't embrace this as an opportunity to be populist without sort of uh, sacrificing whatever its corporatist wing wants to do to appease corporate donors. So it's like
It seems like a
even
no brainer.
yeah, you would think.
Well, these are
So
and the thing that I don't get, like, it's hard for me to understand is like these people are cartoon villains. Like politically speaking, like it's not like they're sympathetic. It's not like it's like, ooh, you
no,
know what? The public might view that like, oh, the poor big bad Brazilian beef brother. Like these people, like if you need somebody to just punch in the face and everybody to cheer, like, yeah, that person needs to get punched in the face. These are it.
yeah,
Like they're
yeah,
not sympathetic in any way.
right. No, not at all. Not at all. Just yeah, cartoon villains is the right term for them. It's insane.
If politics is
Uh,
about choosing the right enemy, like this is the right enemy. Come
oh
on,
gosh,
guys.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh man, and it's it's sort of amusing to see that like folks on the corporatist side of the Democratic Party, the sort of centrist, neoliberal, whatever you want to call them, um, it's sort of funny like seeing them sort of um, what's the word like flounder a little bit in responding to Trump going after the big meat packers. So like one strategy I've seen is like um, they've started calling it like uh, greedflation, 102, or they're like trying to sort of they're talking to like agricultural economists um, who have long been by and large in the pockets of the big ag and then having them having the economists say things like well like you know breaking up the big meat packers might raise beef prices, so like this is just a miss just another Trumpian um, disaster waiting to happen. And yeah, I don't know if I hope it doesn't work for them. I hope, but
I swear, if that
they seem to
becomes
be
like
trying to do that.
if that becomes like the Democratic Party line, I swear I don't know what I'll do, but I will definitely not vote for that party ever again if they decide that that's the route they
Yeah,
want to go with things. I mean, what?
yeah, we'll
It's
see.
just it's there on
Yeah,
it's there on a T. It's on a T. It's on a T
yeah,
right there.
yeah, yeah.
Please
Oh
don't.
man,
I mean,
yeah,
and also, by the way, don't listen to anybody who calls themselves an agriculture economist ever again.
yeah,
Just don't do it.
yeah, yeah. No, it's Matt Stoller, who's been a great uh, advocate in the anti-monopoly space for a long time. He wrote this article a few years back about um, at the time there was a fight, and there's still a fight that ranchers were calling for Congress to pass a bill so that the big four meat packers have to buy their cattle from the open cash market instead of being able to just um, buy their cattle through these exclusive contracts with feedlots that sort of take cattle off the open market and hold the cattle captive. And and they were there was a hearing in Congress about it, and basically you had ranchers testifying about what's going on in the market and what they're seeing. And then you had this economist come in, this agricultural economist come in and just start talking about like whatever modeling exercise he did and just saying, and he literally said like, while we may have these emotional debates about what's going on, like the economics is just isn't there to support the notion that there's any problem whatsoever. Everything is fine. Just don't worry about it. And for a long time, I think we've had politicians and I think even voters who've been willing to accept that sort of line. We had that sort of deference. But
I
I
would
think
like
people
to
have finally
amend.
wised up. Say what?
I'd like to amend my statement. I'd like to amend my statement. So please don't listen to agricultural economists ever again. I think I would like to amend that saying, please don't listen to anyone who calls themselves an economist ever again. Like, I just think that that field is like it should just be canceled. Can we bring back cancel culture just for economists? Like, let's make that a dirty
It's
word.
yeah, yeah. Yeah. It's sort of yeah. It's like there's different ways to use economics, and I think like when it's used to sort of you know uh inductively to like understand what's going on, then that's a good thing. But when it's used to sort of justify what's going on, I think that's when you end up when it goes off the rails. And unfortunately, that's basically how it's been used the last 40 years. So maybe we just
Yeah.
need to yeah, maybe we just need to toss them aside and find something else. But yeah,
Start
uh,
over.
start over.
Well,
Yeah,
I think on that note, we're gonna get rid of economists and put down the JBS dog. We're solving everything here, but
yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
it all sort of is summarized by dethroning sort of centralized power and their lackeys. So that's the sort of and the paradox, right? And the paradox of like to do that, we need to use power, right? And I think that's the problem that we often run into is the idea of like, well, if this sort of centralized power is the problem, we could never use power. And it's like, well, there is no choice. That is the only way. You just have to be, yeah. You have to be very judicious and careful about it and very specific. Here's these anti-monopoly laws. That's what the government does. Right now, we have a government whose scope is to do everything under the sun except what actually fucking matters.
Right. Exactly. Yes. Yes. And yeah. And I'll close with this sentiment. I think we've been here before, right? We're not powerless in the face of corporate concentration of power, nor are we powerless in the face of ineffective government that seems to regulate all the wrong things in all the wrong ways. We've been here before. We were here in the 1920s. We were here in the early 1930s, and eventually, the cataclysm of a Great Depression, and hopefully we don't have to go through that again, made us realize that um, we need to we need a government that um, we need a government that fights the concentration of power so that people can make of their lives what they will, and so that we have free enterprise and actual free markets. And I think you know the sort of we unleashed a campaign of anti-monopoly lawsuits to do that. We did, we broke up, we broke up the fertilizer trust, and we broke up the meat trust, and we broke up, we brought lawsuits across the agricultural supply chain to restore free, open and fair competition, and it worked. It led to 30 years of you know uh, expanding agricultural markets, um, with inputs that were improving, but whose cost was either declining or staying flat over those years. And we had, roughly fair markets for farmers, livestock, and crops. Um, and I think you know, to the point about sort of like what kind of policy do we need to have in order to do that again. I like to sort of all refer back oftentimes to this speech that um, Robert Jackson, who was the head of the Antitrust Division at the time, gave in 1937 to sort of kick off this this trust busting campaign. In that speech, he said our solution of the anti-monopoly problems must be in terms of our ideals, the ideals of political and economic democracy. Um, he said we do not want um, bureaucracy or regimentation of any kind. We do not want um, uh, detailed regulation of prices by the government, nor price fixing by private interests. Um, but in the end, we cannot allow private corporations to be private governments. We must keep our economic system under the control of the people who live by and under it. And I think that's the sentiment we have to take with us today. That's the kind of government we need today, is a government that is not out to, you know, impose bureaucracy or regimentation on anybody, but is trying to make sure that we are not subjected to private rule, and we're, all able to participate in these markets in ways that are healthy um, and productive for all of us. So yeah, yeah, I'm optimistic. I think we can do it. We just need to keep pushing our leaders to, grow a backbone and get it done.
Yeah, I think the developments are all are positive, so it's very exciting. And thanks for being here and helping us break that down. Um, appreciate your expertise very much. And yeah, until next
Glad to be
time.
here.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
glad to be here. This was great. Thanks so much.